Greetings, New Zealand friends. Kia ora. And many of you actually are my friends. I'm recording this from Wisconsin, USA, about a week before your conference. You're all gathered there to figure out a path forward. You understand lots of the storm clouds headed our way. There is a cultural road closed sign metaphorically ahead of us. Sarah asked me to do a 20-minute or so overview of how those humans who are acting as the scout team to be catalysts for cultural change, especially in a remote place in the world such as New Zealand, can think about what's ahead and change the initial conditions of what's coming. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of our situation, some of the risks we face, and I'm going to spend most of the time just offering some suggestions on responses ahead of what I refer to as the great simplification. I don't think there are solutions per se, because this is a predicament, not a problem. I also hope to see some of you in person. I think I'm coming to Australia and New Zealand to meet with politicians and do some talks and meet with some friends end of February, early March 2024. Fingers crossed and the nukes don't fly. I will be with some of you in 6 months. Okay, here we go. Some main points, and those of you that follow my podcast are aware of these, but let me briefly reiterate some of the central points that brought us to this moment. Cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy, particularly oil, underpins our societies and our cultural expectations of the future. This is a stock that we've treated as a flow, and we're burning through it millions of times faster than it was built up. Growth, economic growth for the world is probably soon over. And what that means is the first challenge is responding to the financial musical chair situation that was created while we kicked the can on the way up. Rather than recognize this and choose austerity, governments and central banks, your central bank and mine, will choose to print and monetize debt, which allows us to continue to consume at high levels, which will eventually lead to currency reform and truly a biophysical musical chairs situation. We do not have a resource shortage situation per se, but rather a longage of expectations. In the United States, the average person consumes in our body a bit over 2,000 calories a day, but we consume in our culture about 215,000 calories a day of oil, coal, gas, and other energy in the form of shopping centers, NASCAR races, hospitals, universities, commerce, Amazon trucks, etc. I'm sure New Zealand is similar. This is ultimately good news because we don't need all this energy and stuff to be happy. Renewables and technology and innovation and efficiency are the right answers to the wrong questions. Right now, we're using those things to grow this currently growing, unsustainable leviathan of an economic culture. We're going to need those things, but at a smaller scale and complexity. There is a biophysical phase shift occurring in the global economy with politics, alliances, currencies, etc. The BRICS just announced a new additional members last week. Fully 50% of the exportable oil in the world is now produced in BRICS nations. This is going to have implications not only for global trade alliances, but military and other things. Climate change is happening. It's real, it's urgent, but it is not the problem, but rather a symptom of a larger dynamic dysfunction. My work has talked about the global economic superorganism, where we self-organize as individuals, as families, as small businesses, as corporations, as nation states, to maximize financial surplus tethered to energy, tethered to carbon, and climate change is an externality of that economic organization. This complex predicament and the responses I'm about to articulate cannot yet be voiced aloud in the media and in politics, but because they're too dissonant from the cultural narrative of technology and money continuing growth and human supremacy, ignoring the ecological underpinnings of our lives. Finally, our resource tech situation, what we have left, what we know, can power a wonderful human civilization and culture, just not this one. So some of you have looked at the logic that I've put out in recent videos. I think any degrowth scenario that is successful, any fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that is successful, any major cultural change that moves away from our current system, first must navigate the four horsemen of the coming decade. And that's why I'm going to come up with recommendations that apply to all these situations. Briefly, we have a financial bend versus break situation. We create debt much faster than we create GDP. And so we're creating monetary claims on energy, materials, and ecosystems while we're keeping the energy, material, and ecosystems around the same level. So eventually this will stretch so far that it will snap back or it will break. This is something we likely have to face in the next decade. I mentioned earlier geopolitics. Currently, there is a kinetic war happening between NATO and Ukraine, in Ukraine versus Russia. We don't know how that's going to manifest, but the stability and peace we've had since World War II is now on shakier foundations. A third horseman is the complexity of a six-continent, just-in-time supply chain, which people in New Zealand are emotionally probably more aware than the average person. We have all kinds of important goods and services that are dependent on letters of credit, cheap oil, Byzantine global transport structures, and this is something that we've taken for granted. Lastly, we have the social contract, where people who generally don't watch the same news sources or care about the same things are going to have to be part of a political discourse. And all the things, AI and politics and climate change and economic poverty, these things tend to splinter our social discourse, and we're going to need to maintain that in order to be able to talk about these issues. Okay, so the reason Sarah and Mike Joy and others invited me, what the heck do we do? Knowing about this stuff, what do we do? Well, my work has been about the intersection of these four horsemen and with the environment, which is something I deeply care about. The environment has kind of three categories. The metabolism, which is the biosphere impacts that are downstream of our energy use, which is mostly CO2 generating energy, over 8%, 80% of it, and that has impacts on the biosphere, the oceans, climate, etc. Then there's everything else that doesn't have to do with our metabolism, tearing down forests, biodiversity loss, endocrine disrupting chemicals, plastics, etc. And then there's what are the impacts post-growth once we start to not have as much cheap access to energy and credit. We'll be looking to the environment to supplement our current declining living standards with forest biomass, for one example. So the story of our lives is how all this stuff intersects, but the responses aren't really at the intersection of all these things, but they're at the totality of all these things. How do we fit this all together? So, as I mentioned, we have a cultural road closed sign ahead of us. How do we change the initial conditions of the future? If you kind of squint and know that our culture en masse is not going to consciously leave carbon in the ground, consciously degrow and tighten our belts in an austerity way, if you really understand what's ahead, we can kind of envision a time capsule. What would we put in that time capsule? And if we put things in that time capsule using our cognitive, non-emotional brain, can we, as individuals, as small groups, and maybe as organizations in New Zealand, start to do these things ahead of when we're going to be forced to do them? So here's a short list of suggestions. And once again, I've spent 20 years understanding the problem, the constraints of how the system synthesis of the human predicament fits together. I'm not only a communicator and an educator in this, but I'm also a client. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's coming, but here are some suggestions I have based on 20 years of working on this. Okay, number one is we have to start thinking 2 steps or 3 steps ahead. We can't look at the news items today and say, oh, let's respond to that. We have to think about how all this stuff fits together and plan for things that we might not get the emotional and informational cues from the environment or the media or from politics. Because right now there's so much going on in the world, we can easily be distracted. But just like driving in a snowstorm, you can look 2 cars ahead of you at the brake lights and kind of make changes. So those of you sitting in the audience, start thinking about 2 steps ahead. One thing that is kind of apparent to me is when the belly of the beast of the great simplification and what's coming to our economies becomes more known, people will want to be closer to the social and economic power that exists. They won't want to be, not everyone will want to be at the end of a 6-continent supply chain. So I would expect some people repatriate to the mainland, various mainlands, Australia, Asia, North America, and leave New Zealand because it is so remote. Having said that, at the same time, once people figure all this out, there will be people, potentially lots of people, that want to be remote for various reasons. So think about what both of these things might mean for your communities and your preparation. I've named my podcast The Great Simplification because humans have, over centuries and millennia, used innovation and technology to solve problems. And in that, it builds complexity. And we've done this in the era of ever rising energy access. The inverse of that is when we suddenly have less energy and less affordable energy every year, the inverse will happen, which is a simplification. In my opinion, this will be one of the greatest events ever for the human species. So I call it a great simplification. But if you intuitively, emotionally know that humans and the New Zealand government and the global situation will not voluntarily degrow and tighten our belts, it actually leaves you in an interesting, empowering space, because that recognition allows you to simplify first and beat the rush. And for many of you sitting in the audience, simplifying, reducing consumption, making yourself more flexible to things in the future actually could improve your life today. Now, the thing with reducing complexity is the ongoing clarion call of our current cultural narrative will not only continue, but it will probably intensify. And people will want more technology and more money, and the feeling of being left out from the herd will be palpable. But just like the tortoise and the hare in the fable, the tortoise went slower and actually won the race. So there will be a cost to reducing complexity ahead of time. And those communities and those nations that choose to, in part or largely or fully ahead of time, to decomplexify, will look like they're losing the race, when in fact they're actually living more like all of us will need to live in coming decades. So reducing complexity is hard to do, but New Zealand, for many reasons, has an opportunity to do that Los Angeles might not. Pro-social prepping. When you think about what's coming, the initial instinct might be to buy gold and guns and Bitcoin and beans. And for some people that might make sense, but for a society, for a nation, for a community like Nelson, New Zealand, we are going to need to integrate and come together and have a pro-social response. It's funny, I tried to find images on the internet of a pro-social response of communities kind of acting in synergy towards a common purpose. You can't really find any images. So all I could find was pictures of the Amish in Indiana in the United States. But we need to somehow start conversations with people around us that disagree with us. We need to start building social networks. Even if we don't actually accomplish anything, we need to build the human social capital ahead of when we're forced to. New Zealand also has an opportunity to do that. The superorganism is embedded in all aspects of our current life. And once you're aware of that dynamic, we can wall off some of the externalities of the superorganism, where we have one foot in both worlds. And we, for instance, have a Jevons paradox dividend, where we have some technology or some windfall profit, and instead of putting it back into the business as usual energy hungry superorganism, we put that towards some greenhouses or something in our community that will prepare us for the great simplification. So we have to start living in both worlds and gradually wall off some of the tentacles of the superorganism in our own lives and in our communities. We have been transmuting nature into money over the last century. And this has been the pursuit of our culture. It's kind of the ecocide equivalent of King Midas. So we have to rethink about asset allocation during the carbon pulse. On the upswing, people own stocks and bonds. Now at the peak of the carbon pulse, there might be a different diversification where there's stocks, bonds, cash, and commodities like gold or land. But where we're ultimately headed is finance, or these monetary markers on reality, are just representations of what we really care about, which is social capital, our friends, our networks; natural capital, which New Zealand is incredibly rich in, our forest, our fresh water, our ecosystems; our human capital, which is our knowledge, our skills, our health; and built capital, which is our solar panels, our tractors, our computers, our clothes, our chainsaws, things that we actually use. And I think, especially for philanthropists, we are truly playing a monetary musical chair situation. And the reverse transmutation of the last century needs to be accelerated now, the reverse of it, which is we need to turn financial digits and linen, New Zealand Kiwi dollars or whatever they're called, into real things. Because not all of our financial claims on reality will ever be repaid. So at some point, we will need to transmute those into real things. And I think those people and communities that do that wisely ahead of time will have advantages. I think at the end of the day, we need to change how our neurotransmitter smorgasbord has gone from a wide, holistic, healthy portfolio in ancestral times to a one-legged stool of dopamine taking over the story in our modern culture. We need to re-examine our individual relationship with consumption and addiction and behaviors, we need to recognize that after basic needs are met, most of the best things in life are free, that self-worth can be the new net worth. And this happens at the level of an individual, but it also can work in small groups, in communities, in villages, in areas, in regions where we need people to care and heal and live as human beings instead of constantly tethered to the supernormal stimuli of our phones and other things. This is really, really important because most of us have trauma and some addiction problems. And the antidote to that is to live with humans at human scales, gardening, in nature, music, cooking, so that we have a portfolio of options other than turning on Netflix or doom scrolling through your phone. And so we need to build options for when we have a craving for our one-legged stool. And again, I'm a client in this regard. I don't know the answers here, but I think the human behavior aspect of this is huge. We can't forget the species and ecosystems that we inhabit this planet with. They will not have a voice during a degrowth scenario. So some of you watching this presentation, some of you who love the fauna and flora of Aotearoa and want to play a role will have to self-organize into some sort of a life brigade, because these species that don't have a voice need human champions. And we've gotten this enormous subsidy of fossil carbon and materials, and we're taking for granted the subsidy we get from nature and the other species that share this blue-green planet with us. So a no superorganism allowed sign is something that an effort worth undertaking. No one is going to help the creatures and the ecosystems and the soil and the microbiota and the forest in New Zealand other than you. So some people, I hope, will take that on as a mission of deep purpose. Rocks in the river is my metaphor for, as the water starts rushing in our economic and environmental predicament, many people that are untethered will tumble down the river, metaphorically. And those people that are emotionally, psychologically, skill-wise mature and have processed this, have grieved about it, have plans, are resilient psychologically and physically, can act as anchors. They can act as rocks in the river that not only help others from tumbling downstream, but if there's enough of them, they actually redirect the direction of the water. So don't necessarily ask, how do I prepare for the great simplification or degrowth? Ask, what can I do with my network, with my personal unique skills? What can I do for Nelson or Christchurch or any other of the small communities in New Zealand? And I think you'll be happy and maybe surprised to find the answer. New Zealand has more listeners per capita of any country in the world to my podcast. Having said that, I know that business as usual and denial of some of the problems that I've articulated here is also quite large in New Zealand. So there are many different demographics and tribes with many different beliefs. And I think an important skill is to be a diplomat or facilitator between these tribes, which means even if we strongly believe the degrowth message, or that we're going to have to be living incredibly simpler lives, and technology is only a vector to have more ecosystem destruction, or whatever your flavor on this giant story is, we have to temporarily suppress our identity and be in real relationship with others. Many of them will be your close friends, and many will not, but they're in your community. And we need to build this network of cohesion ahead of when events get dicey. So we're going to need mimetic community diplomats. Lastly, there's unknown. We are part of this global superorganism, and yet you sitting in the audience are starting to know you're part of a global economic superorganism. We know where we came from, what we need, what we're doing, what's possible. Does this change the conversation? I don't think we're going to be able to regenerate landscapes and our national discourse until we regenerate the culture that can steward these landscapes. New Zealand has an incredible opportunity. This is a favorite quote of mine: when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence can shift the entire system. New Zealand is remote. Everyone knows that. There is a lot of pro-social thinking and action on the ground. It is an incredibly natural resource endowed nation. There are deeply movements that care about the future, and it's a low population density, so there is a smaller there's a smaller speed bump threshold to have political action and political movement. This is a reason why I'm willing to come to New Zealand when it has a smaller population than my own state of Wisconsin, because similar to Scandinavia, it is one of the few places that actually can act as a pilot for ways that humans live differently ahead of the Great Simplification. I think you all have a wonderful challenge ahead of you, and I look forward to seeing what satellite discussions and projects and movements emanate from this conference. And thank you all. I hope to see you soon.